Yeah, please stop this
3 minutes after
conversation.
6.
Please go for it.
It's time to get down to business. We would just like to thank you both organizations for coming. It's been a while, I think, since we've done a joint Planning Commission and City Council session. And we have 2 important topics on the agenda this evening. So just to kind of walk through what the plan is, Alisand is going to be running through the Smith Farm Plan Unit Development. And it's been a while since we've done a planned unit development, and we have a relatively new planning commission with several new members. So we thought that this would be a good opportunity to give you, an additional time to hear about the development, the background, what's been going on, and let us know if you have any questions around it prior to us thinking about scheduling a public hearing. Then depending on how long that takes, we can take a little short break. And then I am going to cover cottage housing as some potential zoning text amendments to allow kind of a new type of development within the city. Also give you the opportunity for some questions, and that should do it. So I'm going to turn it over to Alisand, and she is going to work through the Smith Farm Plan Unit Development.
Okay. Alrighty, so I'm going to start by sort of going over what a planned unit development is, since it has been a while since we've done one of these. So just a quick definition, planned unit developments, or PUDs, are described as being a land development project comprehensively planned as an entity by an overall site plan which permits flexibility in buildings, siting, mixtures of housing types and land uses, usable open spaces, and the preservation of significant natural features. So broadly, that's what a PUD is. They're a useful tool for certain properties because they allow developers more flexibility to create mixed-use developments that incorporate traditional neighborhood design while also providing a mix of housing types, and also the ability to protect a property's natural resources, should a property have that, by clustering development in certain areas so those natural resources can be better protected. And they're able to do this by not strictly abiding by the requirements of the zoning or subdivision ordinances, because they create their own code of development that guides the development that's unique to that particular property. The city does permit PUDs. Our zoning ordinance requires that a code of development includes 6 things. First, an introduction to the project, a concept plan, development's permitted uses, the area and dimensional standards that will guide the development, details about the required common areas and amenities, and then also design guidelines. So after that sort of overview of PUDs, we'll get into some background about this particular property, the Smith Farm. So this property is located on the northern side of the city and is approximately 142 acres. It is zoned RS12, which is our single-family residential large lot. The comprehensive plan has it designated as low-density residential, and its probably most known feature is that it is the location of the former Augusta County District home, which is now in disrepair. Here's a quick location map showing the property itself and some of the surrounding land uses. The uses are primarily single-family residential. To the south, you have denser single-family attached and multifamily with the New Summit Towns subdivision, and you have Parkway Village right there. And then over to the west, you've got Evershire and Claybrook and Ivy Commons. And then you also have Hannah's Ridge up here, which is beginning development. And then on the northern side, as you go into Augusta County, you have more rural single-family residential, and then to the east you have some industrial and then also single-family residential uses as well. So this particular property was intended to be gifted to the city for use as a park and conservation land. The general area was indicated on the 2008 comprehensive land use map as a future public park location. However, the city did have concerns about the burden this large of a park would place on the Parks and Rec Department in regards to the maintenance, and then also, adding on to that, the liability of that old district home building that is in significant disrepair at this point. And then also in 2022, 2023, there's a stream restoration project that got started on the stream that flows through the property in a couple locations. And as part of that, a conservation easement was placed on this area around that stream that placed restrictions on what uses would be permitted within those areas, specifically protected by that conservation easement. In 2023, the city did enter into a memorandum of understanding to examine the potential development of the property, which would include some provision of public park land, the demolition and removal of the district home building, and then also conservation of property elsewhere in the city. City staff has been working with the applicant since the fall of 2023 on a code of development for this property, and that's what we're going to start walking through here. So the Smith Farms Code of Development shows the property being developed in 4 phases, and it'll include a mix of residential types and density. There will be a maximum of 400 units total on the overall property, which equates out to about 2.75 units per acre. Commercial uses will be permitted in certain development areas by a conditional use permit. The Code of Development also includes 60 acres of planned public park land to be dedicated to the city, along with the construction of about 3/4 of a mile of greenway. And then finally, the development also provides some connectivity among the phases of the development itself, and then also to the adjoining properties on the south and western sides. Here is a look at the 4 proposed development areas along with the parkland. To the south, you have the Hopeman Ridge development area. You have Westfield development area over here on the western side. You have Duke Road that sort of follows Duke Road on the northeastern side. And then you have Streamside development area here in purple, also sharing some frontage on Duke Road. And then the green is the public parkland that they're proposing. The development will be done in phases, and they've identified 4 phases. The first phase would be this Hopeman Ridge Parkway area, or Hopeman Ridge development area, and then also the parkland. You can't really see the label there. Phase 2 would be Streamside over on Duke Road. Phase 3 would be Westfield, and then phase 4 would be Duke Road as well. And then finally, a quick look at the concept plan that they've provided. We'll be coming back to this quite a few times as we walk through it. But this concept plan shows what potential development could look like in each of those development areas, along with the associated neighborhood amenities. In red, the most visible are the community trails, and then also you can sort of see in the dark green, in sort of the lower center of the property, the proposed greenway trail. Okay. So the development will be guided by its own area and dimensional standards. The residential development will comply with the zoning ordinances RG5, which is our general residential area and dimensional standards for each of the residential use types. The Code of Development also permits a manufactured home subdivision in the Streamside development area, and that subdivision, along with the manufactured homes within it, will abide by their respective sections of the zoning ordinance as well. I've identified on that slide. And then finally, as I said, any commercial uses that are permitted, commercial uses will be permitted in the Streamside development area, but only by conditional use permit. There will be some site development standards. The site will be developed in a manner consistent with that concept plan I had on the slides a slide or two ago, along with this code of development. Any plats or site plans submitted to the city for review as part of the development will need to comply with the city's zoning and subdivision ordinances, except for otherwise provided in the code of development. And I'll touch on how those differ in just a moment. There will also be restrictions and covenants recorded. There will be restricted covenants recorded, and then also an HOA that will enforce the architectural and landscaping guidelines and also maintain the development's common areas. Any traffic analysis and access management studies will be completed by the developer at each phase of the development. And the developer will be responsible for any warranted upgrades required as a result of those studies. getting into the street design standards. Generally speaking, the development will follow the subdivision ordinance's street design requirements. However, there are a couple specific requirements that have been called out in the CUD that would be unique to this property. Those differences include requirements for the block lengths in the Hopeman Ridge and Streamside development areas, sidelines of lots in the Duke Road development area, and then the maximum length for cul-de-sac streets, along with sidewalks. Sidewalks in this development will only be required on one side of the street instead of both, and then none on Duke Road. And then the remaining street design standard differences have to do with that road connection between the Westfield and Hopeman Ridge development areas. Here, the code development document states that the right-of-way may be less than 50 feet. The city requires a minimum right-of-way of 50 feet in part to ensure the street will qualify for the VDOT road maintenance funding. And it also states that the street grade may be more than 6%. And then finally, it also says that intersections may meet at angles less than 75 degrees. Our ordinance states that intersections should be about 90 degrees, and if not 90, no less than 75. And so it does lessen that requirement, specifically for that road connection between the sections due to the constraints of land in that area, and then also that conservation easement. For the required common areas and amenities, the city's zoning ordinance requires that PUDs include a minimum of 20% common area. For this property, that would be about 28 acres. 60% of that amount, or 17 acres, needs to be contiguous, with about 25%, and that's about 7 acres, improved in some way. And our ordinance contains guidelines about what those improvements can be. Overall, the Smith Farm PUD proposes nearly 60 acres of contiguous parkland that will be dedicated to the city, and then 8.48 acres of improved common areas throughout the property. Depending on the development area, these improvements could be a playground or tot lot, picnic areas, community gardens, mini parks, greens, community trails, the Greenway Trail, and then also the Greenway Trailhead. And then here's another look at that concept plan. And you can, the numbers, the little circles represent locations of various amenities. Then also the red is the, as I said, the community trails, and the Greenway Trail. So with that, we'll start going into each of the phases, and we'll start with phase 1, which is at Hopeman Ridge and the parkland area. So Hopeman Ridge is about 25 acres, not including the parkland, and will permit up to a maximum of 180 dwellings. There will be a mix of unit types permitted that include single-family detached, attached, duplexes, corner lot duplexes, multiplexes, and townhouses. The mix of types permitted in this development is meant to complement the density of the adjacent properties to the south, such as the Evershire townhouses, Summit Towns, and then Parkway Village. This phase will also include the dedication of 60 acres of public parkland, which is that green area in the center there. In addition to the residential construction, this phase will include the construction of any required infrastructure, and that includes roads, utilities, gas, and stormwater. And this phase of development will include 2 connections to the Summit Towns subdivision. It's not real clear on the map, but that would be this area over here, and then right in that area. And because of those connections, it will trigger the right and left turn lane requirements on Hopeman Parkway at both of the entrances into Summit Towns. So this phase will also include those improvements on Hopeman Parkway. This phase will also include the construction of the stream crossing required for that road connection between the Westfield development area here and then the Hopeman Ridge development area. And then this phase will also include the construction of the 3/4 mile of Greenway, along with the development area's amenities, which will include community trails, playground, a picnic area, and then a green. Moving on to phase 2, which is that streamside development area over on Duke Road. This phase contains about 10 acres and will permit up to 50 dwellings. and commercial uses will be permitted in this area by CUP. This area will allow the most variety of housing types with single-family detached, attached, duplexes, corner lot duplexes, multiplexes, townhouses, and a manufactured home subdivision all permitted within this development area. Phase 2 will also include the demolition and removal of the old district home building. And then this phase would also include, of course, the construction of any required infrastructure, along with the greenway trailhead and any neighborhood amenities, which will include community trails and a picnic area for this development area. Moving on to phase 3, that would be the Westfield development area, over on the western side, bordering Ivy Commons in part. So the Westfield development area includes about 35 acres and will permit up to 150 units. The unit types that will be allowed are single-family detached, attached, duplexes, corner lot duplexes, along with townhouses. This phase will include the construction of any of the required infrastructure, along with the road connections to the Hopeman Ridge development area down below, and then also over to Ivy Commons. And then right-of-way will be dedicated along the western boundary in this area to allow for road connections in the future should that property ever develop. And then finally, any neighborhood amenities provided with this phase will be built, including community trails, mini parks, a picnic area, and a community garden for this section. So the final development area is the Duke Road development area. In the northwestern part of the property. So this area contains about 28 acres and will allow up to 20 units. The idea behind this phase is that it would complement the more rural residential development in the vicinity out in Augusta County in this area by providing larger lot, single-family residential dwellings. ADUs will also be permitted on lots larger than 2 acres. And then again, any required infrastructure will be constructed along with the neighborhood amenities with this phase, and that would be community trails. And then finally, the applicant has voluntarily proffered 3 proffers for the rezoning. The first is that the property would be developed in general accordance with the applicable plans and descriptions provided within the Code of Development. The second is that parkland of approximately 60 acres will be dedicated to the City of Waynesboro Parks Department prior to the issuance of the certificate of occupancy for the 181st residential unit, provided that the applicant or developer, its successors or assigned, shall maintain rights to record any and all temporary access or construction easements necessary to complete the scope of work identified or contemplated in the spirit and intent of the PUD concept plan. And then the final proffer states that the district home building located on the parcel 16-1-A will be demolished and properly disposed of within 90 calendar days of the site plan or subdivision plat approval for the Streamside development area, but in no event later than January 1st, 2026. So finally, just quickly, the next steps for the application would be a public hearing with the Planning Commission, and we're expecting that to be at the May 21st meeting in a couple weeks here. And that is all I have on this project, and happy to answer any questions.
And just for just a little bit of additional information related to the background on the project, we did note that staff has had several back and forths with the applicant, probably at least 4 or more iterations at this point. And so the latest one is the one that you all have received and we've presented on this evening. There are still some, comments that staff has that we will relay back to the applicant related to the Code of Development. So I will point that out prior to the May 21st, what is a planned meeting. We will have some back and forth with them also with some additional comments. So I just mainly say that to think of it as it's been kind of a long work in progress and several iterations where staff has provided comments and the applicant has worked to meet those comments and will continue to do so prior to the scheduled public hearing.
So would the lack of the 50-foot right-of-way on a stream crossing potentially not cover the entire length of that road through the development, through the state grant?
So I think the applicant is essentially just intending to make sure, nobody knows what that alignment might look like and what that, they know that they have right at 50 foot of right-of-way past the restoration easement or the conservation easement. And so I think it's kind of, putting it in there so it's noted. There might be some ways we might struggle in that regard, but I do also remind everyone that, this would be the zoning code and the zoning documents, but everything would go through the preliminary plat approval process. Staff will reach out to VDOT and kind of confirm how any one segment may affect an overall roadway in terms of maintenance funding related to potentially less than 50 feet. So that is a question we will make sure we get answered prior to public hearing.
Is that a stream mitigation project in there?
I believe it was related to the DuPont settlement funding, if I'm not wrong, and it is, yes, a stream bank restoration project.
Who holds the enforcement easement on it? Do you know?
It might be DEQ.
I believe it's, yes, DEQ, but we could make sure we confirm that.
I would be curious what
Yeah.
feedback, if any, they had about setbacks.
What has the school board said about the increased load of the students at Winona?
We will get you updated numbers. The last numbers that we have from the superintendent are from
2022,
2022, and they do plan to give us updated numbers in,
at the end of April, so this month, but
this month. They have to do an update anyway, so we will get for whatever they need to meet, and they will provide us those. So we will have updated numbers prior to this, yes.
I think this would be William Perry's district.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would have to. Okay.
Are there plans for stoplights on Hopin?
So, I can't remember if you were on the planning commission yet at the time, but so the Summit Towns development, the townhouse development that fronts on Hopeman, that was roughly 172. So they did a turn lane analysis that determined that they did not trigger any turn lanes, but any future development to the north would trigger those turn lanes. So certainly when this application came through, we brought that up to the applicant. They did a turn lane analysis. Staff reviewed and submitted to VDOT for review. VDOT confirmed that they agree with the turn lane analysis, that yes, turn lanes will be warranted on Hopeman. But VDOT has also looked at the entirety of the development and not made any indication that a more full-blown traffic impact analysis would be required. With the code of development, the applicant did submit that with each development area, with each phase, they would submit some kind of traffic analysis of some degree, maybe not a full-blown TIA, but something to determine and have city staff confirm that those requirements are not met. So it is my understanding from the traffic engineers that have looked at it that no traffic signals would be warranted with the development based on the number, the multiple connections, and kind of the dispersal of traffic related to the development. But again, it would be reviewed at every development stage.
I just know my wife and I use that intersection at Hopeman and Sherwood Rockfish Road every day. And most of the time, we have to keep our head on a swivel to get out of that intersection to make a left turn to head up Hopeman. That's without any of this. That's why I'm bringing up about the stoplight, because there's a curve there, as you know, heading westbound, and cars don't do the speed limit anymore. And you really got to be alert right now. That's without any of this. So we'll see what they, if they do the study and what they come up with.
Aren't you glad we made them align that entry with the crossing, though? Remember all of the round and round about the entry and the crossing and aligning it with the food line entry? Maybe you were on the planning commission.
Yeah, that, the other subdivision is aligned with that food line.
Based on our feedback, they aligned that entrance, which I think is going to serve this development well.
Yeah.
Right, if there are not any other questions, we can,
I got a
go
few.
ahead. Of
Okay,
course,
yeah, I was
of
just waiting
course.
to make sure. First is, could you talk a little bit about the general location of the commercial property envisioned on the stream side component?
Yeah, so we had,
And
again.
why? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
sure.
an odd location.
Sure, so we had several iterations, like I said, back and forth with the applicants. And I think kind of what they were envisioning in that area was more as it, as it transitions into the county, maybe it being more businesses that are conducive to kind of rural residential development. So we were back and forth, and do we specifically define, okay, what those are? Is it some kind of restaurant or maybe some kind of, gardening, landscaping center? Is it, as we kind of talked through all of the possibilities, they kind of said, it's not, we like to leave it open to a possibility, but we really don't have any specific thing in mind. Certainly, don't want anything that's going to create issues or impacts to adjacent properties. So they said, maybe we would just leave it open to say any commercial over there would require a CUP. I do think they have asked us, what are the thoughts on that? I don't think they would have heartburn if we said, no commercial development. I think that they would be fine with that also. So it's no specific use idea in mind, more just kind of leaving it open for the potential to have, maybe a more rural type business that kind of, as it moves out into the county, that would work in that area.
You have to have one of those, the fan blowy things, to tell people, because it's pretty remote up there.
Sure.
Well, I was curious because, I think rather than leaning in on an entitlement with the CUP, which I think could create some consternation in the future about interpretation or otherwise, I think the intent and spirit of this is to create additional housing, scaled housing opportunities for folks that might be interested in moving to the city. And I would have a reservation about creating an entitlement that could take, arguably perhaps the most affordable part of the development and use it for a commercial use such as self-storage, right? So it'll just sit out there and park for forever and ever. So I'd have some reservations about that, and would more be inclined for an amendment to the PUD in the future rather than providing that entitlement right up at the top.
Okay.
The limits of the transportation mitigation impacts, 400 units at a full single-family dwelling is 4,000 cars a day. And obviously, it won't generate the same sort of traffic as a traditional single-family dwelling subdivision, because that's not the use, but it is auto-oriented. The development as envisioned is very auto-oriented. So I guess I want to make sure that we memorialize in the PUD that the expectation that the transportation investigation and mitigation applies to the context of the corridor and not to an isolated area, because those, 2,000 to 4,000, right? So if I'm half wrong, it's still 2,000 cars, 200 cars arriving at Cape Collins and the intersection in the peak hour. So, or somewhere of that neighborhood, 100 additional cars in the peak hour, could be pretty substantial. And if we're looking only at the scale of this project in isolation, that could have some pretty negative effects to it over time. And the other aspect to it was, I guess there's still quite a bit of development to be had along the corridor, and I think I might have mentioned this in a previous, maybe just a sidebar conversation with you about there is adequate right-of-way. I think we've confirmed right-of-way for a future widening of Hopeman Parkway, and but I think not maybe specific to this development, or maybe it is perhaps, is consideration of a special assessment district that as rezonings come into play, as additional PUDs come into play, that there are financial set-asides contributions being made to leverage state and federal grants to evaluate a future widening of Hopeman Parkway. So that's on the global transportation side. Mm-hmm. The aspects of, so there's, the HOA, as envisioned currently, is limited to the common areas. And so, thank you for the clarification of 181 units before it would be flipped onto the city for maintenance and responsibility. I kind of think that's still too soon. I would rather see it basically max out the development before you turn the mowers over to the city of Waynesboro. And upkeep of park amenities and everything else. I think to maximize that to a reasonable extent. Not that 181 is unreasonable, but at a 400 unit development, particularly in multiple phases, you could see a phase get completed and then the rest of it stall for eternity after 182 units, and then we're mowing grass for 182 units, never to see the rest of them in my lifetime. So I'd have a reservation about that. But it is a public road, so there would be an HOA, homeowner association fees assessed for common areas, but it is envisioned that these would all be public roads that would be plowed and maintained by the city.
Yes, so so the dedicated parkland is the 60 acres, then other common elements throughout the developments, because there are some in the approved amenity exhibit, which is hard to see. It's on page, I believe, 11 of, or actually that, I might not have the full packet that you have, but it's the approved amenity exhibit, and it does have numbers that relate to, they are required to have a certain amount of improved, like greens and community garden, community trails. So that is what I envision being HOA maintained in perpetuity. It would be the 60 acres of parkland that would be dedicated to the city, if that answers your question. But yes, the roads would be public.
Right, and I guess my thought with it was in absence of isolation, is why not treat the park amenity as an HOA asset and an HOA amenity? And so that the residents would pay for the mowing and upkeep of that open area rather than.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, yeah, that was just kind of maybe at staff's inclination of our urging to the applicant that the comp plan designates the area for a park. Maybe that's not the direction the city wants to go anymore, and so maybe no public park is envisioned. And that's certainly something that's up for discussion and talking and tweaking with this development.
Yeah. Well, and I don't have an aversion to it. And again, I'm just one person, but if I think it's sort of one or the other of get as, max out the development to the extent practical. Again, not that 181 is impractical, but at 400 units, something over the neighborhood of 300, I think that would be a reasonable spot for the city to sort of become engaged and like, okay, then we can get some ownership and get a mower out there and caring for the property. But in the interim, I think we just, because I don't know, I've seen a lot of developments just stall, and it can be, Frederick County, my goodness, when the housing booms in 2008, 15 years went by before there was any movement on next phases. So it really stalled for a long time, but then the locality was responsible for maintenance. The school division impact, so that's certainly a variable that's curious. So you mentioned the Westfield interparcel connections. And I guess one question I had is it looked like the road that is furthest to the,
Down here.
no, the first subdivision
one.
road, the one, the cul-de-sac, for the first cul-de-sac.
Oh, here.
Is, it's, I'm a neighborhood guy, and so, subdivisions are fine, but I also feel like, the kid that lives at the end of that subdivision shouldn't have to walk all the way to the opposite end to the main thoroughfare to go visit their friend at the other end. That I would be curious and interested to see what accommodation could be provided for general neighborhood access in between from the backside, or at least at a minimum formalize one of those connections to actually create a street interconnection Because otherwise it's, I mean, the truth of the matter is, unless something happens unexpected, those stubs will be stubs for a long time. So, what you have is what you have, and again, again, I think just in the ability to create a more of a neighborhood setting where people can interact and the like, where you're not just isolated to the one single cul-de-sac street that you live on. You mentioned in January 2026 that would be the sort of the no later than 2026 to demo the district home. But I didn't see anything in the packet about recourse. So what's the recourse if that doesn't happen? So, and I think that's all I have.
Can we go back to your thoughts about maybe the parkland area being part of their HOA? Are you saying permanently in the future? Because I can see that this property in the parkland is enclosed, with homes, and primarily the uses are gonna be the folks that live there.
Are going to be folks over there?
But Waynesboro is gonna be maintaining that. I like that idea. I feel like I don't see the rest of Waynesboro utilizing that park.
Right. And when they do, they're visiting someone in the
That's
neighborhood.
exactly right. So I feel like I agree with you on that, maybe being part of the HOA rather than something that we inherit that we have to continue the upkeep on.
Has there been anything in the discussion where they may change their mind on that parkland section and try to develop it since it's such a large parcel?
So the way that everything's drafted right now, they would not have that ability because they would be developing in compliance with the code of development, and they're required to have a certain amount of open space. And certainly anyone can come back and try and amend their code of development, but no, everything they've submitted would prohibit any type of development of that area. And then also, there is a conservation easement that the reason you're not seeing more road connections amongst all these pods is because there's a conservation easement that kind of really restricts that ability. And so I think that area that's designated as that 60 acres for a park is done so because it operates that way. It's not, to cross it would be against the easement language that's held by DEQ, and I think that's not something that they can or are willing to mess with.
Yeah, so when you do a stream bank mitigation development,
Yeah.
they dictate to maximize the linear stream foot credits,
Yeah.
you minimize through the easement the number of stream crossings. That's why they have that problem with that 50-foot right-of-way, is
Yeah.
because the easement restricts. They probably only, when they did the stream bank, only put in for one crossing. So my guess is the 60 acres is landlocked, and they don't buy stream bank. And
So
so
that whole 60 acre, okay.
I would be curious to know if
Yeah.
it is.
Because my thoughts were going to what if they acquire the property behind it, does that make a difference?
Yeah, I think if you look at this, where they've got the stream delineated, it looks to me like, based on where they're showing the
Yeah.
green shading in there, that it's probably
all-
landlocked by
okay.
streams.
All right.
That'd be my guess. I'd like to know the answer to that
Yeah,
question.
yes, and we can send you the easement that shows and the easement language. We can make sure you get copies of that.
And that made me think too of, maybe to a couple folks' thoughts on it, to add on is, the green space that's on that graphic is very pretty, and it looks very passive. I can almost see deers leaping right through the grass, to the meadow. There's not a scale associated with this, but the topo out there is not flat,
No.
by any stretch of the imagination. So,
Well, that
when
was
you
one
look at
thing when they talked
Which
about
led
the
to my
road.
question, which was
Yeah.
gonna be for the planned layout for the park. Were they putting forth that they were gonna create the park area and then turn it over, or are they just turning the land over and expecting Waynesboro to plow it down, level it out, and make a park?
Yeah, so the way that it stands currently, they would be constructing the 3/4 of a mile of greenway. But no, other than what is identified in the amenity map that shows like picnic areas, which again are not in the parkland area. It would just be dedicated land that the city could utilize as a park. They were not proposing to create park amenities within the 60 acres beyond the greenway.
So we could just leave it undeveloped and it would just have a wooded area
And-
or a really just a natural area that would just grow.
I think, yeah, there would be a multitude of, yeah, possibilities. If it
Yeah,
was kind of
but we-
left to the city as more just
Okay.
passive recreation, I would assume.
Okay. So we wouldn't have to do anything with it immediately and wouldn't, there's nothing in there that would mandate that the city turn it into a park.
No, no specific requirements.
How big are them turnarounds? Will they accommodate an engine?
Yeah, so all of, yeah, those specifics would definitely be worked out at the preliminary plat stage. You know, this is just kind of the conceptual layout and may change a little bit as they work through. But yes, that is all things that we would identify with fire and rescue, that any turnarounds or any connections met their requirements. Yeah.
What about utilities, water, sewer?
Yeah,
And-
yeah, so, there are some, we will definitely get you more specific answers as we move into the public hearing stage, but there are some identified notes that, specifics about that. But like all developments, they would have to do that at the time of their preliminary plat to determine that they have utilities available.
And,
And they would all be, the whole development would, yes, utilize public water and sewer.
and going back to Mr. Short's, thoughts about somebody on the first spur trying to get to a friend's house on the last spur, without walking down the road and up a half mile or through everybody's yard, has any thought been given to like a pedestrian access back there, a 6-foot paved walkway?
So there would be the way that it, and again, nothing's set in stone, so things could change. There is proposed to be sidewalk on one side of the street throughout the development. And then you do have those red lines that run throughout the development
Yeah.
are community trails that would help, obviously, with pedestrian access. So that's what's been proposed currently.
Okay, but I don't see any from the first spur on the left to the last hook up on the top. I don't see any red line between them. They still have to come out to the street and walk up, unless they cut through somebody's yard.
Okay.
Yeah, I do say, I mean, I do love the red trail network. I mean,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
that's-
I like the,
I do like the fact that it, you know, had fully envisioned, it allows folks to go trick or treating and have a good time, you know? I mean, you'd be able to cover a lot of ground over there, so I think that's pretty cool.
Those trails that run through them woods right there, are they planned on being lighted?
None of those specifics are part of
Okay.
the proposal. The red trails would be HOA maintained, and I believe would be more, the surface would be kind of more determined by the HOA.
Okay.
And we would be differentiating then between what is the actual greenway, 8-foot constructed path that would be dedicated to the city.
Yeah, his comment about trick or treating triggered my
Yeah,
thoughts
it was, yeah.
about it. If they walking through the woods at Halloween, I mean, is it gonna be lit?
Right.
Leslie, if I understand correctly, that when Mrs. Smith originally planned to gift this property to the city, it was upon her death, is that correct? Do you know those?
That is my understanding, yes.
Yeah, and she had restrictions on the property as far as use and whatnot, and I guess that's all off the table now, right?
So yes, she is interested in working with the applicant for this development, along with kind of the memorandum of understanding that the city entered into to essentially say, you know, we would entertain the possibility of looking at development for this property, knowing that we have public water and sewer and road networks within that area. The burden that 142 acres would place on the city as like full land to be maintained by the city. the idea of the district home, and the liability with that resting then with the developer. So I guess I can't say, it's not off the table today, but it is part of this package and part of the desire to develop the property as discussed tonight would then take that off the table.
I guess the city, after the city expressed their reservations as far as taking this property due to the building, the district-owned building itself and et cetera. Did Mrs. Smith say, okay, if you guys aren't interested, I think I'll just contact her, see if I can find a developer and.
Now, my understanding is that she approached the city first about development. The city didn't approach her about liability or other concerns. I think she was interested in developing and met with the applicant and kind of built a relationship, and then they approached the city. Is that be accurate?
Yeah, I think that relationship was sort of established with Aaron and.
Part of the
Smith
restoration
as part
project.
of the NERDA project, that it was a candidate project to receive NERDA. I don't think it actually received NERDA, but then they were able to use easements, conservation easements in order to create stream restoration and daylighting of streams through another initiative. And so that's sort of how that relationship formed. The timing, timing is everything, right? So, I mean, I think that opportunity that it provides, I think providing, we certainly have, but we've been learning over the last year, specifically the true deficit that exists in housing, and so an ability to have an array of different housing stock for folks to choose from and afford, I think is important and timely, at the same time to sort of relieve the city of long-term future liabilities, and to act upon that now, I think just makes a whole lot of sense. So.
Well, I've got a good list of questions and input and information that you all provided that will help us as we continue to refine the code of development and work with the applicants towards that, what is now proposed to be a May 21st public hearing before the Planning Commission. So if you all want to take a few minutes of break, we can, or if you want to move right into the next topic, I'm happy to do that also.
I'm good to keep rolling.
Good to keep.
You understand there are going to be snacks and beverages? Or?
We'll move on and get you out so you can.
So you can go get your own snacks.
Okay, so we're gonna kind of, definitely still on the topic of housing, but change directions here, and talk a little bit about cottage housing development. So I think really the best way to envision what I'm talking about when I say cottage housing development is by way of comparison and images. So what you see here is an aerial view of the city's existing Evershire development in Waynesboro. So you see single-family detached development as well as townhouse development. You'll note that all the residential units have frontage on a public road, and there are individual driveways and garages that exist on individual lots. And so the delineation of public versus private space in this image is very clear. So very similar to the previous image, this picture shows single-family attached units within the Creekwood development. Again, they all have frontage on a public road, as is required by our subdivision ordinance, and like the previous picture, the delineation between public and private space is clear. These two images that I've shown, they do consist of common elements that are, either managed as a responsibility of the city, like the roads and the sidewalks, or by homeowners or property owners association, like stormwater facilities or open space that's defined by the preliminary plat, or maybe any recreational amenities like pocket parks or playground equipment. So next is a picture of Windy Grove Apartments here in the city, and it differentiates from the other developments because it is multifamily development rather than single-family development. And again, you start to see the way in which private versus public space is defined. The apartments like this one have amenities and shared public spaces that are managed by a property management association, typically. So I point these 3 different developments out representing different types of single-family development and then also multifamily development to kind of describe how more traditional models of development differ from the idea of cottage housing. So this next image is representative of cottage housing and the way that your staff is thinking about it. So it represents a unique space kind of between what we think of as single-family development and what we may think of as multi-family housing and development. And again, this would depend on the model of the development. It could potentially be categorized either way. And I will explain that in more detail as I continue. So in these images, you see that cottage housing is representative of single-family detached housing that may exist on a single lot or potentially on individual lots for ownership, but they would not have frontage, all of them, on a public street. They're often oriented towards some common shared community elements. The parking is often grouped, and then you have some kind of common sidewalk or path construction that would be utilized to access the individual units. So as I previously mentioned, in contrast to those earlier images where there's a clear distinction of public and private space, with cottage housing, you do have a bit more blurring of what represents public, private, and maybe semi-public space with the development. So why are we talking about cottage housing as a possibility in Waynesboro? It represents an important opportunity for infill development. And you can see that in this image here where you have kind of the concept on the right where you have existing development platted out on individual lots, and then maybe you have a vacant parcel within that neighborhood that could be developed upon. So in representing that unique opportunity for infill development, the city does have a finite amount of developable land, and we're certainly seeing an increase in residential construction, and these have mostly been on undeveloped tracts of land that are large, of a certain size that really lend themselves to our traditional zoning and subdivision ordinances. But we do have small infill lots throughout the city that may go underutilized if they're required to meet the standards of our existing subdivision ordinance, which requires that all new lots front on a public road. So cottage housing would be a way to create kind of, you can think of it as small communities within communities that fit into the overall character of the neighborhood. Second, cottage housing captures a different housing need than potentially our traditional zoning and subdivision regulations envision, and maybe is able to meet a different segment of society's needs as far as housing is concerned. So cottage housing might be ideal for those that are wishing to downsize, maybe a single person household, maybe a single parent household, as well as those who desire living in a more tight-knit community than maybe they feel like a traditional development would afford. Next, housing affordability, as we've been talking about, is really a national, state, regional, and local topic of discussion. And one thing that I've really learned about the topic of housing affordability is that it's extremely complex and really does not lend itself to easy or one-size-fits-all solutions. But one potential contribution to the overall solution is zoning changes and is often talked about. And especially zoning changes that would increase flexibility and allow for infill development and density and provide a way to meet a different housing sector need within the community. So these developments would not require the extension of a public road network in order to develop them, which would ultimately reduce costs and potentially make the development more affordable to more members of our community. Another option or another consideration is that depending on whether it is developed as an ownership situation or a renter situation, it may offer a unique opportunity to expand tourism and its connection to kind of outdoor recreation opportunities that have been a prominent strength of Waynesboro and our development. I say this with some hesitancy because there is also often the discussion of how tourism and short-term rentals can exacerbate affordable housing issues. So I do think it's something that we should think about carefully as we draft the ordinance. But it is one option that could be considered with this type of development. And then lastly, cottage housing has been successfully accomplished in other parts of the country, either as ownership opportunities and ownership communities, and there have also been models in other parts of the country as a way of providing transitional supportive housing that is community and service provider oriented for better transition outcomes for certain segments of our population. So now I'd just like to briefly go over some of the considerations that staff would recommend as we draft and work through this ordinance that we will be bringing back to you at a later time. So just to point out, like all uses, the zoning code provides for uses that are by right within zoning designations or uses that would require a conditional use permit. And the city has 5 existing residential districts. And I know most of you are aware, but I think it helps to refresh that we have RS12 and RS7, and there are single-family residential districts that are really established to accommodate primarily, exclusively, single-family detached residential neighborhoods on individual lots. And how those two designations are differentiated is on the basis of their minimum lot area and setback requirements. So RS7, the 7 indicates it requires a minimum lot area of 7,000 square feet, and you have to have a lot width of 60 feet. Our RS12 requires a minimum lot area of 12,000 square feet and a lot width of 75 feet. And as I noted, these are kind of 2 of the most exclusive residential zoning districts within the city. The next designation is our RS5 or our traditional residential district. And it's established to accommodate traditional small lot neighborhoods that are primarily for single-family detached, but also other specified and compatible housing types. The lot areas are 5,000 square feet with a 50-foot wide lot for these areas. And then next is our RG5, or our general residential district, which accommodates higher density residential uses. We allow single-family detached, 2-family houses, townhouses, and multiplexes within that district. We also have an RMX, our mixed residential district, which accommodates a variety of housing and specific non-residential uses. And then the last residential district is our RMF, or our multifamily district, which accommodates multifamily living at higher densities. So I point those out to say that, based on the varying zoning designations, your staff is likely going to recommend and envision cottage housing to be, potentially by right in certain zoning designations based on other uses permitted and intensity, and then requiring a conditional use permit in other districts. And so that is one way that we may envision moving forward. I would also like to draft an ordinance and think it would be beneficial if the ordinance would accommodate the ability to have the development be for rental type models or for ownership type models, to kind of allow, different types of development that may utilize this type of cottage housing style. So that goes to kind of the first bullet point about whether it's by right or conditional use permit, and then what zoning districts. Those are considerations that your staff will make and you will make as you continue to help us refine this ordinance. The rental and ownership models, the potential for short-term rental possibilities and kind of a recreational tourism opportunity. Staff would envision that the buffers for any type of cottage development would really just be governed by your underlying zoning. You have kind of a well thought out buffer requirements based on different uses. Certainly if cottage housing was a conditional use permit, then it would always have the ability to set more stringent buffer requirements through the conditional use permit process. Another consideration that staff will be thinking of is related to the common elements. So those areas within the development that are public space. Is it a condominium requirement? Or if it's more of a rentership and true multifamily situation where it's not divided into individual lots, is there some kind of property management requirement similar to apartment development? And then kind of the next considerations are other things we would identify with the ordinance. So maybe thinking of some kind of housing square footage related to cottage housing, as they are often kind of envisioned as a smaller unit. I have seen ordinances for cottage housing that provide ranges anywhere from 800 to 1,500 square feet. You could also have a cottage housing ordinance that didn't have a square footage range. But staff would likely, start with that in replicating other ordinances. We would envision a building separation. The 10-foot really is just what I have seen in other ordinances. I would certainly be working with our building official and fire department to identify what is, what meets their code, and then what obviously looks the best as far as building separation is concerned. Another consideration that we would put in the ordinance would be building orientations. These types of developments are often oriented around some kind of common element. Maybe it's a meeting area or fire pit area or some kind of common use. But then also note that, the aesthetic appeal of the building for any public roadway would also be important. And so those would be considerations. Staff would likely also advise on some type of density requirement. So in these infill development situations, we would, kind of look at those lot areas and identify, the number of cottage units that may fit within a certain area, and potentially also an acreage requirement for an overall cottage housing development. And then lastly, the ordinance would also cover parking. So what are the access requirements? As I previously mentioned, the parking is often kind of grouped in a communal area, and then kind of individual walkways are provided to the units. It would be developed as a common element, so that would go back to kind of that maintenance of what structure that looked like. But it would often be off an existing street with access to the internal sidewalks. I know that the fire department has a 500-foot requirement to be able to reach a hose to different units. So that would certainly come into play as we work through the ordinance to make sure that we meet those requirements. So I mainly just wanted to provide kind of a high-level overview. When you say the term cottage housing, I'm sure people think of all different types of things. So I thought the images would be helpful to kind of differentiate what we're thinking and what we're talking about. And then also give you a little bit of a flavor of, other ordinances that we've seen and what are some of the considerations that they would make. And then as far as next steps, staff would envision drafting, actually, putting all of these ideas into zoning text amendments that would potentially permit cottage housing within the city of Waynesboro. I envision that to be a May through July process, which would likely involve another time coming back to the Planning Commission prior to having a public hearing, but just kind of letting you see this is the progress we've made and this is where we're at with those text amendments. And then ideally, we would schedule a public hearing for those text amendments before the Planning Commission either in August or September. And then ideally also have a public hearing before council and maybe potential adoption of those text amendments in September or October. So that's all I have related to cottage housing and kind of what it means, and then what next steps we might envision as we work through it. And again, happy to answer any questions. And then also as we continue to draft and you continue to, digest the information that we've presented this evening, if there are any additional considerations that, we maybe didn't mention that you've thought of related to cottage housing, please send them our way. We'd be happy to hear those as we continue to draft an ordinance.
I have a question. Related to the short-term rentals for tourism, is that something that the city is interested in operating?
No, so the main reason I bring it up is, we allow short-term rentals in various ways throughout the city within our zoning ordinance, and then it's certainly, tax-wise handled, through the Commissioner of Revenue. But I mainly just pointed it out because the cottage housing model, I think can be a lot of things. I think it could be transitional housing. I think it could be like I said, ownership opportunities for individuals that just really like that unique type of community. And then I also think it could be, very conducive to what we think of as kind of a recreational type community, or maybe, campground's not the right word, but kind of an area where, people are utilizing the benefits of the area in some tourism capacity. But again, I do think it's important to be careful of, maybe that's a conditional use permit, because you do kind of have to check how that affects your overall housing stock. But no, nothing that the city is interested in operating, more just to allow that ability for a developer that may be interested.
For Airbnbs and maybe short-term rentals, like 30-day rentals.
And I will say that the Winchester has a cottage ordinance, and they specifically prohibit that the cottage ordinance be utilized for short-term rentals. So I do think it would definitely be a locality-specific decision. We would have to determine if that made sense for us. But I do think it could be a potential model if that was desirable.
Talking about the fire and how the separation of the buildings and such is, on some of the smaller ones from the picture you showed, how close they are in like a little, it's almost like a communal area. Is there any way that we could require, like fire suppression or stuff in each one of the individual units? Because at that close proximity and that small, if one caught on fire, it seems to think all of them would go, yeah.
Sure, so we will definitely be working with fire and the building official as we draft the ordinance. And any concerns they have about that, or any code requirements they can point to, will definitely be something that will come up. And I know that does with all of the development reviews we do, but definitely distances and then access and how far their hose can stretch will definitely be considerations. And yeah, potentially other additional fire suppression. I would have to check with them to see what they think is warranted. But we will be working with them.
I mean, it looks all well and good, but it reminds me of something I've seen in Gatlinburg, Tennessee with them rental cabins. I don't picture them being homes that people are actually living in 365. I think they're gonna be, hey, come here, stay for a week, look at the parkway, and you ain't gotta go home, but you gotta get out of here.
Well, I know, I think it could be a potential model, but we could draft an ordinance where that's not a possibility, that they're a rental option in terms of a short-term kind of recreational rental option. I can send some examples. There have been several of these developments kind of in the northwest area of the country. And they are home ownership opportunities, and people, that have an interest in kind of either downsizing, or maybe it's a single person that still wants to live in a single-family detached home, might have interest in.
Are their ordinances structured to keep the Airbnbs and the 7-day rentals out of them?
Some that I have seen do preclude short-term rentals, yes. So I think it would definitely be it's kind of one of those, as we move forward, keep that in mind of whether or not cottage housing, you want it to have a short-term rental possibility or not. And I think that is definitely something we, should keep in our mind as we move forward.
What, if you know, and if not, we can talk about it when we talk about drafting the ordinance, but what's the rationale for the square footage restrictions?
So that is interesting, because like I said, I don't think you would have to have them. I think from other ordinances and the developments that I've seen, truly trying to make it an infill development situation and a more of affordable product, that has been the case. But you could have this type of development. I think of like Old Trail Village, where they're fronting on, they don't have road access, and they're fronting on some kind of common grass area, and there's uniqueness around that also. So I guess, it would in the end come down to kind of what the desire was, and maybe there is no requirement or no restriction, and then it could be either.
Yeah, and that's why I
Yeah.
asked. I struggle to understand what
Yeah.
why we would sort of add an arbitrary,
Well, I don't think it's arbitrary. So that's the one way that we can control the building of affordable housing. So if you limit square footage, it's going to minimize the resale prices. So, you know, if you build a 2,500 square foot home, 4 of them beside each other, you're going to $300,000 a piece. But if you restrict it to between 600 and 1,200, you're going to suppress that final cost, 50%. So it's a way for us to actually mandate more affordable housing in an area, maybe you incentivize smaller units by saying, potentially in the code that you do square footage, allowable built square footage on the property. So if I go with 800 square foot housing, I can get 2 more houses. Each house is more affordable and creates affordable single family housing starter homes, but then I can get more out of that same piece of property.
And I do think it's helpful when we're kind of dipping our toe into this ordinance, that maybe we maybe don't put as many parameters on it, and we see kind of, what the market may desire in that area. But certainly your point's well taken. If the desire is, with this ordinance, to have more affordable housing, then it is a way of, again, it would have to be still the desire of that property owner to do it. They could still just, on an infill lot like there in the corner, just build a single family house.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't, have 7 new units within that area. So it would be up to them to decide. So yeah, I think I could see benefits either way, and I'd be happy to look into a little more research behind that and kind of what some other localities have done.
yeah, I'm just curious about
Sure.
that. That's the reason I asked the question.
So we're talking about communities. You also mentioned some lots that might be smaller and not large enough for a normal single-family home. So what type of lot size are you thinking, minimum lot size, before we allow this? And then the other thought is the potential for homes to build a cottage-style home in their back lot for possibly a mother-in-law or a suite like that, or a man cave, whatever you call it.
So to your second point, the accessory dwelling unit, which is like a mother-in-law suite or something like that, that would be governed separately. We wouldn't we already have that ordinance that we allow. It's by conditional use permit in all cases, or
Is permitted by right in all cases except for.
of the size.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's permitted actually by right in all cases unless they go over a certain size. So that's already there in our ordinance, so this wouldn't change that. As far as minimum lot size, I guess what I was talking about is, say you have an infill lot like that one down on the corner where they're showing the cottage development. It might be large enough that you could put, some more housing on it if density was your goal. But and I think of, certain examples that we have where in order to put a public road in and have lots front on that public road, whether they be townhouses or otherwise, is almost cost prohibitive to the development. They just, it's large enough, they could get more density, but putting a public road in, it's not big enough that they're getting the return for all of that investment. So I see this being a potential area where, you're able to create a little bit more density without having to maybe do that. I think I've seen one ordinance where it required 8,000 square feet as maybe a requirement to do a cottage housing development. Again, we could come up with our own, but that would be one potential consideration, and then have some kind of density requirement of X number of units per square footage.
Are any of the ordinances that you've looked at, Leslie, and I'm gonna use your 8,000 square foot lot size, just cause do they say how many of these little cottages you could put on there?
Yeah, so some of the, and again, I might be mixing ordinances, so I don't want to, make this seem definitive, but some of them I've seen would say like, a cottage style development would be anywhere from 4 to 12 cottages. And then that range would obviously depend on the size of the lot. So yeah, that we could start with something like that where, no more than 12 potentially, and this would have to be the acreage in order to accomplish that. And a lot of that just gets governed by, site requirements, but yes, that, we could look into that in more specifics and kind of what those different square footages are. But that is something that we would be considering moving forward, and any text and draft we bring you, you would be able to kind of comment to those specifics.
So I just want to make it clear, we're talking about developments, not just cottage homes on any little small available lots. And there's several 25 by 125 foot lots in Ward A. We're not talking about single-family dwellings popping up on those little lots.
Yeah.
So if a lot exists today, right, I don't want to get this wrong, Laura, but if a lot exists today, and they can meet, we don't have any type of square footage size on the home. Like, it doesn't have to be a certain size. Our ordinance doesn't have anything today. So as long as they're meeting setback requirements, they could build on a lot today. We don't have a minimum housing size in our current ordinance.
They could build a real super narrow house.
Like a shotgun style house.
So this would not affect that because we allow any size house today.
Well, in my ward, you'd have to have at least 50 foot. It cannot be a 25-foot wide lot that fronts road. So I'm envisioning all these little 25-foot width lots.
That's exactly what I was
Cottage
thinking
homes
about.
popping up throughout the city. That's what I'm trying to get a
So
little
yes, this
clarity
ordinance
on.
is not trying to change anything that exists today as far as that's concerned. It would really be a development that could exist, having multiple single-family detached units on one lot. But certainly it would have to be of a certain size, and that would all be part of the ordinance. But no, it's not saying we're kind of ignoring all other zoning regulations that are in place today for individual lots. I hope that was
Yeah,
clear.
I just.
Sure.
So the definition of the cottage is a stick developed home. Nobody could come in and take a lot and put 4 or 5 like small campers with underpinning and a little pitch on the roof and a deck around it and call that a cottage lot.
So yes.
I've seen it. I
Yeah,
mean,
so certainly that's something we could build into the ordinance that would clarify what we intend, but yes, that's what staff was intending.
Yeah.
Or a tiny
Units
home.
that were constructed.
A tiny home.
Yeah, on wheels, yeah.
Or at 800 square feet, they go over at Byler's Barnes and
Yeah.
buy 10 of them, drop them on a lot.
And they
9
could,
shipping containers.
they
yeah.
could potentially be, manufactured in constructed elsewhere and brought and placed on a foundation. That could be a consideration. It would still be permitted the way we permit the foundation and make sure, the tiny house, if that's what you call it, is built to certain standards and then placed. That would be a possibility.
So I mentioned to you once before, I was approached once upon a time by a group that was doing like a more independent assisted living little community like that. And they had like one house was there for the nurse and the on-call people and that. So is there any differentiation between commercial just versus residential? Because that would be considered a commercial business, right?
Yeah, and so today when I was kind of thinking through the presentation, I called out the residential districts. There are certain commercial districts that we have where we allow certain types of residential development. So I haven't, thought about it enough. Your staff may recommend you could have cottage housing in some of your business districts, might make sense. But no, as far as we are thinking about this more as housing,
Yeah.
at either in a rental capacity or in an ownership capacity.
So along those lines, and maybe it'll be the downer here, but I think because, we're not unique in the sense that that the housing stock hasn't is that far apart, but we do have parts of our community that were built in the 1800s, and we do have some parts of our community that were built last week, and so the context of that housing is so different and variable, so I'll mention this, see how it goes over, is associating this with an architectural or material standard.
Yep.
So that when you place it in, because I think the other thing too is that we really need a variety of photo examples of real world things, primarily in the southeast. Because, Portland, Seattle, I don't know where that picture was
That's
taken.
where they are
Okay.
primarily,
So,
Washington.
yeah, I mean, I've got friends that live in those sorts of little areas, and might look pleasant for some folks in the city, but, maybe over on, Indian Head, that wouldn't be something that anybody would want to see. To go from a ranch sort of neighborhood context to a double-story pitched roof, multiple units on there. I think having a variety and socializing that amongst council and our planning commission colleagues ahead of time, so we review that so that you don't get too far ahead with your ordinance development, I think is important, because context will be everything. And I would certainly not want anybody now or in the future, 10 years from now, ever to approve one of these thinking that they're gonna get one thing, but they get something very, very different. They sell it to a neighborhood, you're gonna get one thing, but you're gonna get something very, very different. So that would be a departure for the city to have general architectural or material standards for these sorts of things, but I think regulating it in that way does kind of, that's not something you have to do forever, but the first few of these really have to get right. It's kind of like putting a roundabout in the community for the first time, You gotta make it work, the first one out, so just have confidence. The other question I had is that have we received any inquiries for this, or is it just more or less leaning into other opportunities for housing stock?
We have not received any direct land use application requests, but certainly have heard of, even when I was with the county and with the city, from, builders that have mentioned, have you thought about a cottage housing style ordinance, and other organizations. So no submitted land use applications, but definitely have had interest and have individuals interested in potentially doing it, yes.
Okay. You mentioned underlying buffers, and that the zoning district underlying buffers would rule the day. And I would offer that in some of our residential districts, the buffers, side-by-side, lot buffers are fairly significant. And if you're gonna, maybe Indian Head is the right street to kind of go down, and maybe that's the kind of thing that would look nice on a quarter lot. I probably don't need the side lot buffer that I have in the tree streets, or in Park Republic. I probably don't need that width. And I think to not lock us down on side lot buffers, rear lot buffers, even front lot buffers, to be honest with you. I don't know if that is, so yay for more homework, right? Because then you gotta look at every single one and.
Well, and maybe it goes back to the fact that a conditional use permit might make sense potentially in every situation rather than by right,
Right.
because you are able to then define architectural standards and
Right.
define buffers as part of the permit. And
Right.
so maybe that's.
And again, it's one of those things, is like probably single-family homes are probably conditional use permits at one point, facetious, but,
Sure.
that's
We're
something-
starting out. We're
If you can kind
easing in.
of slow roll in, get it right from the beginning, I just kind of think that would be good.
Yep.
And the last one, unrelated, but a little bit to the mayor's question, is Waynesboro is, it's my understanding, so I'll qualify this, but it's my understanding, talking to colleagues from other parts of the state, is unique in that as a city, our building standards for accessory dwelling units are more stringent than some other communities around, related that you can't go buy a Byler barn and you can't put it in the back, hook it up to water and sewer, and call it an accessory dwelling unit. And so I would be, as an aside, would be curious as to, is that still the case? I just want to know why. Because it isn't the case in every city in Virginia.
Yeah, I will get back to you on that. I know some of the items are building code related, we have certain zoning requirements, so I'll be happy to get back to you on that.
Yeah.
And continue it as part of this
I
conversation.
would love
so
to say,
everybody's
well, it's
aware.
because everybody else is screwing up, you know? It sounds good to me. That's all I had, thank
Well, I
you.
appreciate your questions because it did lead into a question I was gonna ask, and that was about the by right. I was not comfortable starting out as a by right development.
Really sets it up.
It's, yeah, not when we really don't, we may
You have to
not-
get the ordinance really right in
You
the
have to
beginning.
get it really right,
Yeah.
and I would hate to go into this and then suddenly we have lots of by right developments popping up that just are not a great fit. Yeah.
Yeah, if you go down Richmond Road in Stanton, where one of the Ballard building type places down there, they've got one that sits out on the street. That's every bit of 700 to 800 square feet, and it's 2 levels.
Oh, yeah, that's the one I like.
I'd hate to see the price tag on it, but,
Right.
you know, you see those start popping up all over town, then. that could
Yeah,
be-
'cause
that
one
could
of
be bad.
them ain't gonna fit in every neighborhood.
No,
And,
no.
you know, I can envision over where I live on D Street, there's a few places over there that have, the houses already have 2 or 3 lots attached to them. I'd hate to see one of these or 2 of these pop up on those little lots as a quick moneymaker.
Well, sure, and I think it goes back to what Mrs. Williams was saying, is really, we would be identifying kind of a large enough infill lot that could have a range of 4 to X cottage units. But yes, that will all be defined as we work through what would be that lot size and potentially how many could fit in given lot size. But I'm not thinking of it as one lot gets one small, I mean, because that could happen
That's what I was
today
envisioning.
based on certain requirements, whether it meets setbacks.
Couldn't figure out how to do that.
Would,
Yeah.
Out
you
there
could.
now.
would connected homes, like similar to Patterson Court, be considered cottage homes?
So I mean, the term cottage housing, developers will call housing different things. So sometimes people might refer to attached as like a cottage style development. That's really not what we're envisioning.
Okay.
But ironically, Nigel, that was the very first one that I thought of when she was going to the presentation was
Yeah, a lot
Patterson
of times,
Court.
like, or a villa home
Yeah.
or a cottage home, that is a popular term for them,
Right.
that builders use.
13th and Chestnut.
Yeah.
We're just
Or-
designated the cottage homes, it's not road frontage.
Essentially, that's how I think of it from a zoning and land use standpoint. And then planning speak calls it cottage housing. I've also seen it called cluster cottage housing. We have a cluster ordinance, but again, it still requires public road frontage and all those, so this is trying to fit kind of a new niche.
Do we have, oh, go ahead, Nigel, I'm sorry.
That wasn't me.
That's
Oh,
perfect.
why wouldn't you, if you wanted to do this and you own one of these lots, why wouldn't you put townhouses in? Would townhouses be permissible under the current?
So it would depend how we draft our ordinance. If we allow it as a conditional use permit in, say, RS7, you can't have townhouses in RS7. So it depends on how flexible we want to be. If it's an RG5 zoned lot that allows townhouses, then likely, they might make the decision to do townhouses over.
So we're not talking about just detached, we'd be talking about potentially townhouses as well, under this proposed, or under what we're sort of thinking about globally.
No, so I envision them being, with the cottage housing, they would be single-family detached units. I guess I was saying that if we draft the ordinance to allow these as a conditional use permit in RS7, then a person could not build townhouses now in RS7. So this might get them more density than would be allowed in the underlying. But no, townhouse development would just be the same as it is. This wouldn't affect that. It wouldn't
So-
create
so
an
this would-
opportunity
so-
for townhouse
So
development.
this ordinance that we're thinking about right now would only
Be cottage
be
housing.
Detached.
Detached, single-family detached.
To make sure I'm clear.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, if we haven't
Make that clear. Yes.
drawn the line in the sand, I
Yeah.
think that would be
Yeah.
a line in the sand to draw.
Yeah.
Going back to Ms. Williams' suggestion, are there any controls in place? Because I can think of 3 places right off the top of my head, within a quarter mile of where I live, the houses have multiple lots attached to them, but they're all 25-foot wide. Are there controls in place to prevent somebody from saying, hey, I want to combine these 3 lots now, I got 75 by 150, and put one of them in?
Yeah, so we have a process that you can combine, it's a subdivision process,
Yeah.
which seems counterintuitive, but yes, you can eliminate your lot lines and create a lot as long as it's conforming to our existing zoning ordinance. And then, yes, in that situation, if those 3 25-foot lots, however square footage of those became X square footage, and whatever potential ordinance we draft someday allows that that number, then it could be a possibility. Yes, you can consolidate lots. Right. Thank you all so much
Thank
for
you.
being
Thank
here
you.
and all your great questions and input. It'll really help us as we move forward. It won't just be a shot in the dark. Thanks.